Hi, I'm your cheerleader to your lawyering journey. Please support me by subscribing and letting those ads play. It pays the internet bill. Human rights definition. All persons are born free and equal in dignity and rights, without any distinction as to race, color, sex, religion, origin, and social status. United Nations definition of human rights. Human rights are generally defined as those rights which are inherent in our nature, and without which we cannot live as human beings. The denial of human rights and fundamental freedoms not only is an individual and personal tragedy, but also creates social and political unrest, sowing the seeds of violence and conflict within and between societies and nations. Respect for human rights and human dignity is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Philippine Commission on Human Rights definition. Human rights are supreme, inherent, and inalienable rights to life, dignity, and self-development. It is the essence of these rights that makes man human. Man's responsibility in human society. While freedom gives man the right to make moral decisions, he is responsible for doing so and has to answer to his own conscience. Freedom and responsibility includes rights and obligations. The freedom of the individual is demarcated by the freedom of others and by a sense of responsibility. Basic characteristics of human rights. Inherent, because they are not granted by any person or authority. Fundamental, because without them the life and the dignity of man will be meaningless. Inalienable, because they cannot be rightfully taken away from a free individual. Imprescriptible, because they cannot be lost even by a long passage of time. Indivisible, because they are not capable of being divided. Universal, because it applies to all human beings irrespective of their origin, status, or condition or place where they live. Interdependent, because the fulfillment or exercise of one cannot be had without the realization of the other. A legitimate state should exist to assure that in the discharge of the governmental functions, the dignity, that is, the birthright of every human being, is duly safeguarded. Classification of rights. According to source, natural rights are God-given rights acknowledged by everybody to be morally good. Constitutional rights are those rights which are conferred and protected by the Constitution and which cannot be modified or taken away by the law-making body. Statutory rights are those rights which are provided by law promulgated by the law-making body and consequently may be abolished by the same body. According to recipient, individual rights, those rights being accorded to individuals. Collective rights, also called as people's right or solidarity rights, are rights of the society, those that can be enjoyed only in company with others. According to aspect of life, civil rights are those rights which the law will enforce at the instance of private individuals for the purpose of securing to them the enjoyment of their means of happiness. Political rights are those rights which enable us to participate in running the affairs of the government, either directly or indirectly. Economic and social rights are those which the law confers upon the people to enable them to achieve social and economic development, thereby ensuring them their well-being, happiness, and financial security. Cultural rights are those rights that ensure the well-being of the individual and foster the preservation, enrichment, and dynamic evolution of national culture. According to struggle and recognition, first generation of human rights covers civil and political rights. Second generation of human rights covers economic, social, and cultural rights. Third generation of human rights covers collective rights, according to its derogability. Non-derogable or absolute rights are those that cannot be suspended, nor taken away, nor restricted, limited, even in extreme emergency and even if the government invokes national security. Derogable or relative rights may be suspended or restricted or limited depending on the circumstances which call for the preservation of social life. Requirements for restrictions to be valid. It is provided for by law, which is made known to every citizen. There is a state of emergency. It does not exceed what is strictly necessary to achieve the purpose. Categories of human rights as fundamental freedom and political rights, guaranteed in Article 3 of the Philippine Constitution, Article 19, civil and political rights. As democratic rights, commonly exercised in a democratic state, which is guaranteed in Article 1 and 3 of the Philippine Constitution, Articles 2, 4, and 5, civil and political rights. As mobility rights, the third category is the right to travel and to return to one's country, and the freedom of movement within the country, guaranteed in Article 2, civil and political rights, Article 3, Section 6 of the Philippine Constitution. As to right to life, liberty, and security of the person, represents the core of fundamental rights which relate to the right to physical and personal integrity, consistent with human dignity, guaranteed in Article 3, Section 1, Philippine Constitution, Article 6, civil and political rights. As legal rights, includes the freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, and the protection against unreasonable search and seizure, right to counsel, right to fair and public trial, presumption of innocence, and the right against self-incrimination, guaranteed in Article 3, Section 12 of the Philippine Constitution. As rights of equality, it is also known as the right against discrimination. Everyone is equal before the law and is entitled to equal protection of the equal benefit of the law. As economic, social, and cultural rights, includes the right to social security, social insurance, protection and assistance to the family, the right to an adequate standard of living, adequate food, clothing, and housing, and the right to physical and mental health. As workers' rights, include the right to association, the right to organize unions, to bargain collectively, the prohibition of forced labor, the prohibition of employment of children, and guarantee minimum wages and other support. As aboriginal rights, these rights are associated with the rights of indigenous cultural tribes or communities guaranteed in Article 14, Section 17 of the Philippine Constitution. As reproductive rights, include the right to found a family and bear children, to gender sensitivity and the biomedical technology, and to family planning, guaranteed in Article 2, Section 12, which provides protection of the life of the unborn. As protective rights of persons in armed conflicts, these rights are provided in the international humanitarian law for the protection of children, women, and non-combatants during internal armed conflicts. As right to self-determination, the right of the people to be free from colonial rule and decide their own destiny, as provided in Article 2, Section 7 Philippine Constitution, Article 1 Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As minority group rights, these rights include the protection of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities. Human rights without any limitation. Certain rights may never be limited or suspended even in emergency situations. Freedom from torture, freedom from enslavement or servitude, freedom from imprisonment for debt, freedom from retroactive penal laws, right to recognition as a person before the law, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, Theories of sources of rights. Theological approach. It implies that the divine source gives human beings a high value of worth. It is a basis of human rights theory stemming from law higher than the state and whose source is the supreme being. In short, the dignity of human person is realized through love of fellow men. Natural law theory. Thomas Aquinas, foremost among medieval philosophers, considered natural law as law of right reason in accordance with the law of God. It implies that the natural characteristics of human beings are the social impulses to live peacefully and in harmony with others, whatever conformed to the nature of men as natural human beings was right and just. Historical theory. It advocates that the human rights are not deliberate creation or the effort of man, but they have already existed through the common consciousness of the people of what is right and just. Examples are customs and tradition. Functional and sociological approach. It explains that human rights exist as a means of social control. Human rights exist to serve the social interests of society. It lays emphasis of obtaining a just equilibrium of multifarious interest among prevailing moral sentiments and the social and economic conditions of the time and place. Positivist Theory. It states that all rights and authority come from the state and what officials have promulgated. The only law is what is commanded by the sovereign. A right is enjoyed only if it is recognized and protected by legislation promulgated by the state. A positivist system offers flexibility to meet changing needs since it is under human control. Marxist Theory. It emphasizes the interest of society over an individual man's interest. Individual freedom is recognized only after the interest of society is served. It is concerned with economic and social rights over civil and political rights of community. Theory based on equality and respect. It means the recognition of individual rights in the enjoyment of the basic freedoms such as freedom of speech, religion, assembly, fair trial, and access to courts. Theory based on justice. Each person possesses inviolability founded on justice. Each person has equal right to the whole system of liberties. There is no justice in a community where there are social and economic equalities. The general conception of justice is one of fairness and those social primary goods, such as liberation, opportunity, and income, are to be distributed equitably. Theory based on dignity of man. The ultimate goal of this theory is a world community where there is democratic sharing and distribution of values. Utilitarian Theory. It is the principle that requires governments to maximize the total net sum of citizens. This is in contrast to the natural right theory, which is an individualizing principle that assigns specific basic interests of each individual person. Miranda Doctrine. The ruling applies during the investigation of a detained person. He has the right to be informed of the charges against him and to be assisted by an independent and competent counsel of his own choice when making a statement. It is guaranteed in RA 7438. Section 12, number 1. Any person under investigation for the commission of an offense shall have the right to be informed of his right to remain silent and to have competent and independent counsel, preferably of his own choice. If the person cannot afford the services of counsel, he must be provided with one. These rights cannot be waived except in writing and in the presence of counsel. Number 2. No torture, force, violence, threat, intimidation, or any other means which vitiate the free will shall be used against him. Secret detention places, solitary, incommunicado, or other similar forms of detention are prohibited. 3. Any confession or admission obtained in violation of this or Section 17 hereof shall be inadmissible in evidence against him. 4. The law shall provide for penal and civil sanctions for violations of this section, as well as compensation to the rehabilitation of victims of torture or similar practices and their families. Double jeopardy, cited in Article 14, Section 7, Political Covenant. Its counterpart in the Constitution is Article 3, Section 21 of the Philippine Constitution states that no person shall be twice put in jeopardy of punishment of the same offense. If an act is punished by a law in an ordinance, conviction or acquittal under either shall constitute a bar to another prosecution for the same act. Requisites for the protection against double jeopardy: a valid complaint or information before a competent court, defendant had pleaded to the charge, and defendant was acquitted or convicted, or the case against him was dismissed or otherwise terminated without the express consent of the defendant. Right to strike. The strike is a temporary stoppage of work by concerted action of employees as a result of a labor dispute. Similarly, the Philippine Constitution guarantees under Article 13, Section 3 that the state shall afford full protection to labor, local and overseas, organized and unorganized, and promote full employment and equality of employment opportunities for all. The right to strike is related to the right to organize for collective bargaining in accordance with law. Right of students and academic freedom. The Supreme Court had ruled in a number of cases that the internal conditions for academic freedom in a university are that the academic staff should have a de facto control of the following functions, namely, the admission and examination of students, the curricula for courses of study, the appointment and tenure of office of academic staff, the allocation of income among the different categories of expenditure. In the determination of standards to be met, students possess a privilege and not a right, while under Education Act of 1982, students have the right to freely choose their field of study subject to existing curricula, and to continue their course therein up to graduation. Such right is subject, as all rights are, to the established academic and disciplinary standards laid down by the academic institution. Ex post facto law. Ex post facto law means a statute which renders a previously innocent act a criminal offense, aggravates or increases the punishment for a crime, or alters the rules of evidence, or deprives an accused of some protection or defense previously available. This is guaranteed in Article 15, Section 1, Political Covenant, which is similarly phrased in the Philippine Constitution, wherein it states that no ex post facto law or bill of attainder shall be enacted. Article 3, Section 22. Commission on Human Rights under Article 13, Human Rights. Section 17, Number 1. There is hereby created an independent office called Commission on Human Rights. The commission shall be composed of a chairman and 4 members who must be natural-born citizens of the Philippines, and a majority of whom shall be members of the bar. The term of office and other qualifications and disabilities of the members of the commission shall be provided by law. 3. Until this commission is constituted, the existing Presidential Committee on Human Rights shall continue to exercise its present functions and powers. 4. The approved annual appropriations of the Commission shall be automatically and regularly released. Section 18. The Commission on Human Rights shall have the following powers and functions. 1. To investigate on its own or in complaint by any party all forms of human rights violations involving civil and political rights. 2. Adopt its operational guidelines and rules of procedure, and cite for contempt for violations thereof in accordance with the rules of court. 3. Provide appropriate legal measures for the protection of human rights of all persons within the Philippines, as well as Filipinos residing abroad, and provide for preventive measures and legal aid services to the underprivileged whose human rights have been violated or need protection. 4. Exercise visitorial powers over jails, prisons, or detention facilities. 5. Establish a continuing program of research, education, and information to enhance respect for the primacy of human rights. 6. Recommend to the Congress effective measures to promote human rights and to provide for compensation to victims of violations of human rights or their families. 7. Monitor the Philippine government's compliance with international treaty obligations on human rights. 8. Grant immunity from prosecution to any person whose testimony or whose possession of documents or other evidence is necessary or convenient to determine the truth in any investigation conducted by it or under its authority. 9. Request the assistance of any department, bureau, office, or agency in the performance of its functions. 10. Appoint its officers and employees in accordance with law. And 11. Perform such other duties and functions as may be provided by law. And Section 19. The Congress may provide for other cases of violation of human rights that should fall within the authority of the Commission, taking into account its recommendations. Q&A on Human Rights by Attorney Kokia. Number 1. What do you understand by human rights? Answer. Human rights are universal legal guarantees protecting individuals and groups against actions which interfere with fundamental freedoms and human dignity. Human rights are generally defined as those rights which are inherent in our nature and without which we cannot live as human beings. These rights and fundamental freedoms allow us to develop and use our human qualities, intelligence, talents, and conscience, and to satisfy our spiritual and other needs. The dignity of man and human life is inviolable. From the dignity of man is derived the right of every person to free development of his personality. It's the essence of these rights that make man human. Basic characteristics: inherent, fundamental, inalienable, imprescriptible, indivisible, universal, interdependent. Classified to according to source: natural rights, constitutional rights, statutory rights. B. According to recipient: individual rights, collective rights. C. According to aspect of life: civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. D. According to struggle for recognition: first, second, and third generation rights. And E. According to derogability: absolute or non-derogable, derogable or can be limited rights. Number 2. What are the sources of human rights? A. Natural rights: God-given rights unwritten prevails as norms of society. B. Constitutional rights: conferred and protected by the Constitution and cannot be modified or taken away by law-making body. And C. Statutory rights: provided by law, promulgated by the law-making body, and may be abolished by the same. Are the answers. 3. Who are entitled to enjoy human rights? All. 4. How did the violation of human rights originate? History has shown that as man started to live in society, his inherent rights began to be violated by his own fellow men. The state authorities who are supposed to protect his rights are even his persecutors. 5. Who were the first violators of human rights? The first violators were the Greeks and Romans, who were supposed to have started the development of Western civilization. They legalized the institution of slavery when men and women were hailed as chattels and could be disposed of in any manner. 6. Human rights are characterized as inherent. Why? Give examples. Not granted by any person or authority, do not need any event for their existence. Example, right to life and dignity as a human being. 7. Human rights are fundamental. Why? Without them, the life and dignity of man will be meaningless. Example, right to individual liberty and security of a person, or freedom of thought and religion. 8. Human rights are inalienable. Why? Cannot be rightfully taken away from an individual. Example, freedom from torture. 9. Human rights are imprescriptible. Why? Cannot be lost even by a long passage of time. Example, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Number 10. Human rights are indivisible. Why? Not capable of being divided. Example, freedom of belief or opinion, freedom of religion and worship. 11. Human rights are universal. Give example. No borders applies to all. Example, right to life is the same whether one is in Asia or Europe. 12. Human rights are interdependent. Why? The fulfillment or exercise of one cannot be had without the realization of the other. Example, one's right to life and existence as a person cannot be realized without one's right to work and maintain a good standard of living. 13. What do you mean by second generation of human rights? Give example. Covers economic, social, and cultural rights, which primarily find their origin in the socialist tradition and have been variously promoted by revolutionary struggles and welfare movement. Also known as social welfare rights. Example, right to development, right to work under decent living conditions, right of workers to self-organization. 14. What are third and fourth generation of human rights? Give example of each. Covers collective rights, best understood as a product of both the rise and decline of the nation states in the last half of the 20th century. Example, right of people to a healthy environment. Chapter 2. What famous documents in history that contained concepts of human rights? Briefly discuss each of these documents. A. Magna Carta of 1215. First English Constitution delivered by King John. It guaranteed personal liberties and civil rights. B. Bill of Rights of 1689. Revolutionaries of England, determined to prevent arbitrary royal rule, laid this down. This document guaranteed freedom from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive fines. Bill of Rights, 1776. Americans revolting from the English. This document asserted that all men by nature are fully free and independent and have inherent rights such as enjoyment of life and liberty, the means of acquiring and possessing of properties and obtaining happiness. Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789, by French revolutionaries. This document declared that all men are born free and equal and affirmed the inalienable rights of man. Explain why human rights became an international concern. The struggle for the respect of human rights was initially a domestic or a national issue, but the atrocities committed en masse of people during World War II convinced international jurists that the protection of human rights should be an international concern. How was human rights introduced in the Philippines? Human rights was introduced to the Philippines when Jose Rizal wrote about the abuses of the Spanish authorities in his books, and he was executed for it. Since 1896, the educated Filipinos were already aware of the American and English Bill of Rights, and the Malolos Constitution was adopted in 1899. It contained provisions that guaranteed freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, freedom from searches and seizures, freedom to choose domicile, and freedom of religion. What historical events in the Philippines prompted Filipinos to protect and promote human rights? Colonial Spanish regime, economic and class discrimination was rife. B. Military rule of Japan from 1942 to 1944. Martial law of President Marcos. What consists of International Bill of Human Rights? Article 2, Section 11, it reads, the state values the dignity of every human person and guarantees full respect for human rights. To implement this policy, the Commission on Human Rights was created as a constitutional independent body under Article 13, Section 17 to 19 of the Philippine Constitution. This resulted to a substantial decrease of number of violations among law enforcement in human rights, but there is still much to be done. Q. State and explain the constitutional policy of Philippines on human rights. The new Constitution, the 1987 Constitution, states that the state values the dignity of every human person and guarantees full respect for human rights. Chapter 3. What are the reasons why the reaffirmation of the fundamental human rights was one of the main objectives of the Organization of the United Nations? Enforce equal human rights. To reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of human person. UN Charter Preamble. Recognition and respect of human rights and freedoms not due to discrimination. To achieve universal respect for an observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. What documents compose the International Bill of Human Rights? United Nations Charter, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Name some of the fundamental human rights and explain each briefly. Equal protection of rights. Human beings must have equal rights, no discrimination. Right to life, liberty, and property. Right to privacy, no arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, communication, correspondence. Freedom of speech, expression, and religion. Inviolable right to express oneself unless justifiably limited by the government. What international instruments have been adopted to serve as legally binding treaties on the countries that ratify them? International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both overseen by the UN. What are some hindrances or obstacles to the enforcement of the human rights international instruments? War crimes, authoritarian regimes headed by dictators. Under Article 2, Paragraph 7 of UN Charter, that gives no authority to the UN to investigate matters happening within the domestic jurisdiction of the country or nation. What are the remedies to deal in the hindrances or obstacles in the enforcement of human rights? Implementing international treaties as local legislation. Chapter 4. What do you understand by civil rights? Civil rights are the rights which the law will enforce at the instance of individual without discrimination for the enjoyment of their lives, liberty, and means of happiness. How is civil right distinguished from political right? Both are protected personal rights, but political rights are especially catering to the right to participate directly or indirectly in the establishment or administration of government. Political rights are rights to enable people to participate in running the affairs of the government. Why are these rights called negative rights? In answer to restraint, the tyrannical government. Example, no one should be tortured. No one should be deprived of freedom of expression. No one should be deprived of life. Mention at least 3 basic civil rights and how they are applied in Philippine society. Right to life, liberty, and property. Article 3, Section 1, no person, not even the state, has the authority to take one's life. Right to privacy, Article 3, Section 3, right to be free from intrusion into certain thoughts and activities. Freedom of expression, Article 3, Section 4 to 5, right to self-determination. Discuss at least 3 rights of a person who is accused of a crime. Right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation against him. Right to bail. Right to meet the witnesses face to face. Article 3, Section 14. What do you understand by the principle of presumption of innocence of an accused person? What is the reason of such presumption? This means that an accused cannot be presumed to have committed the charges against without the proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The accused cannot be imprisoned just based on circumstantial evidence. The strict compliance with this is the court's policy on protecting an actually innocent person from going to jail. What do you understand by the right of persons to peaceably assemble? Are there limitations or restrictions to this right? Peaceful assembly means the right of citizens to meet peacefully for consultation in respect to public issues and to petition the government for redress or grievance. This right can be restricted on grounds of national security, public order, the protection of public health or morals, or the protection of the rights of others. Chapter 5. Briefly explain what is meant by economic, social, and cultural rights. They are the commitments of the state for opportunities to achieve equality and distributive justice to its citizens, such as the right to food, clothing, housing, and education. It included the right to work with fair and just wages, decent working conditions, and protection of the family to maintain the decent standard of living. Why are these rights considered as social welfare rights? They are generally stated as positive undertaking or obligations of the government to ensure economic well-being of the people. Why are these rights also called affirmative rights? They are viewed as goals or aspirations that government should provide for its citizens depending upon its resources. What are the main purposes of the economic rights? To promote high standard of living, full enjoyment and conditions of economic and social progress and development. What do you mean by social rights? Cite examples. Social rights are those rights concerned with basic human needs. Example: right to development, right to self-determination, right of workers to self-organization, right to work under decent living conditions, right to work in third world countries, right to strike as against property rights, right to social security, protection of and assistance to family, right to education and development of human personality, right to student and academic freedom, participation in cultural life and benefits of scientific progress, religious education and instruction, and right to high standard of physical and mental health. What do you mean by cultural rights? Rights that aim at assuring the enjoyment of culture and its components in condition of quality, human dignity, and non-discrimination. Example: right to provide funds for the promotion of cultural development, promotion of awareness and enjoyment of the cultural heritage of national ethnic groups and minorities and of indigenous peoples, preservation and presentation of mankind's cultural heritage, legislation protecting the freedom of artistic creation and performance. Mention some provisions in the Philippine Constitution on economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. 1. Article 12 on the national economy and patrimony. Article 13 on social justice and human rights, agrarian and natural resources, urban land reform and housing, health women. Article 14 on education, science and technology, arts, culture, sports. And finally, Article 15 on the family. What are the obligations of developing industrialized countries towards this world, countries on economic, social, and cultural rights. State parties are obliged to take steps individually and through international assistance and operation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources, with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant. What is meant by public interest and social litigation? It's the actions or remedies to enforce and implement economic, social, and cultural rights. Must be accessible to all people, should be simple and at the minimum cost. Free from technical forms of pleadings, rules of procedure in such cases should be relaxed, and social, legal fact-finding bodies should be appointed to determine facts in issue. How should the state comply with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights? By incorporating in their constitution most of the rights enumerated in the International Covenant in Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and implementation of it through social legislation. What is meant by right of development? Inalienable human right by virtue of which human person and all people are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. Example, economic prosperity, social, political, and cultural employment, social reform, economic reform, agricultural reform, agrarian reform, and natural resources, infrastructure development, governance, and development financing. Who are most vulnerable to violations of human rights? Answer: women, children, youth, indigenous culture minorities, Muslim population, elderly, disabled people, mentally disabled people, prisoners and detainees, internally displaced people, migrant workers, urban poor, refugees and stateless persons, laborers, public, private, and informal, rural workers, peasants and fishermen, house helpers,